In 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. And welcome Crowdcast, and welcome everyone streaming live on LinkedIn to the Real Leaders Podcast with the CEO of Good Think and Positive Psychologist, Shawn Achor, joining us today. Shawn, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, before we begin, Shawn, just want to let our audience know, listening here on Crowdcast as on LinkedIn, that they can ask questions. So if you're watching this episode, you're interested, you have some questions for Shawn that don't get asked, please, by all means, ask your questions in the chat box on the right. Secondly, if you enjoy this episode today, folks, and you want to listen to it to make sure that you are notified of when Shawn's episode is released and other leaders that come on the show, please, by all means, subscribe to the Real Leaders Podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts. We're on Spotify, Google Play, any place that you listen to a podcast, I bet you can find us on there. And then lastly, folks, the call to action right here today is just leave a review, folks. It really helps out the show. If you could leave us a review, let us know what you think, how we can improve, and what people can expect when they come to this show. We would appreciate it. With that being said, folks, we will go live in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And welcome everyone to this episode of the Real Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Edwards. Joining us today is positive psychologist Shawn Achor. Shawn, welcome to my happy place.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So Shawn, you're a positive psychologist. What exactly does that entail, and how did you get involved?
Well, I fell backwards into it. So I was studying at Harvard Divinity School. I was studying Christian and Buddhist ethics. I grew up in Waco, Texas. I'd seen mostly Christianity, wanted to expose and study something else. So I got fascinated by, how do your beliefs about the world change the way you act in it? So that's what I was looking at. And some people in the psychology department said, we want to ask those same questions. We just want to do it with a scientific lens. Could we measure if somebody can become more compassionate, or can they become happier, or what happens when the brain becomes more optimistic? And I was like, you can't do that. Happiness is a mystery. And they said, we're using the same metrics we use to study depression. We're just looking at the other side of the curve. We're looking at why somebody could actually improve their life, not just how do we move people from a depressed or disordered state back up to normal. And I got hooked, because if we could study individuals that are thriving, we could learn something great. So positive psychology is this movement in psychology that, instead of studying only depression disorder, it looks at these outliers, these weirdos in the data that are positive, and figures out why they're so positive, what they're doing, and what we can learn to move the entire average up.
So Shawn, what are some of those metrics that you would be measuring in someone who's clinically depressed?
So if you want to look at all of them, you can go actually to University of Pennsylvania has a fantastic website. If you just Google University of Pennsylvania and positive psychology, it'll take you right to their website. And it has a list of all the positive psychology metrics that we use that are free. You can actually test yourself. You can log into their system and look to see how you score on measures of optimism or resilience or social connection. Basically, what we did was we tried to create a series of questions that, when we asked a large enough sample of people, that when we put those answers together, it was actually predictive not only of one number, like we could say, well, this is your optimism number, but if that doesn't correlate with anything, it's useless. But if we found a number for optimism that then correlated with higher levels of longevity, or higher levels of resilience for a Marine, or increased business outcomes for a leader, then we have something that we can actually use, because then we could see, are people moving up and down, and can people change?
So Shawn, how long have you been doing this for?
Gosh, the Divinity School is in 2002, but I really started getting into positive psychology when my mentor, Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar at Harvard, pulled me into it. Positive psychology started in 1998. I left Harvard in 2008 to start bringing this research out to the world, because I felt like it's one thing to study happiness in a laboratory on college freshmen that we're grading and determine what creates happiness there. What I got fascinated by is the banking crisis and the economic crisis was occurring in 2008. So I saw all this need for this positive psychology, and we've been researching it for years. That's when I made the move to start bringing this out to companies and to schools, and now I've traveled to 50 countries sharing this research. So more than 12 years now.
Interesting. So what would you do, or how would you help a company that's going through a hard time? If you were to go and speak to them to maybe boost the morale, like how would one perform an exercise for that?
It's different for different organizations, right? Some want to have me in for just a talk, right? So for an hour at a sales conference, I'll share some of this positive psychology information. When we go for deeper dives into organizations, which is where we actually do the research, usually we're doing a 1 or 2 day positive psychology intervention where we expose people to the idea that their actions and their daily work routines could change their levels of happiness. So we show them, here's some habits and work routines we've studied that raise your long-term levels of happiness. Then we show how those correlate with their own key performance indicators there. And we do this as teams, so they're not doing this alone, they're doing it with one another. So I know a lot of people don't have time to read a whole book, on positive psychology. So I wrote a little parable actually years ago, 10 years ago, about this frog that's green but has these orange spots. So it's called the orange frog. But the whole point of it was he hated being orange because it made him different. But then he started realizing as he did these certain actions, he became more orange, which made him more different from all the other frogs. But then he started realizing it was contagious and advantageous. And then he starts to change these other ponds. And when this flood comes, they work together to build their houses up in the tree. So they're tree frogs. So what we used was this little narrative to encapsulate what we've been learning on the science of positive psychology, to give language inside organizations to these very simple concepts, but to become something that we could actually sustain over time. So on that point, I had a Harvard Business Review article published in May of this year on looking at what we went to a hospital system for 4 years before COVID began. And we looked to see, we knew they were going to go through massive cost reduction, staff reduction. So a really difficult time. And their question was, how do we start talking about happiness, right? Where I have to let people go. Let's wait till this is over, then we'll start talking about happiness, right? And it's what we could feel like right now, right? As soon as all these changes with the pandemic or political or economic landscape are over, then let's start talking about happiness. What we did was we just tested. We compared departments that continued on trying to go through the challenge like they were. And then the other ones, we exposed them. We used the orange frog intervention, but basically a positive psychology intervention, given license to their leaders to start talking about the positive and creating work routines. And what we saw was the groups and the departments, same hospital system that started talking about the positive, their burnout rates dropped in half. Likelihood of expressing optimism rose by 20%. Happiness scores rose, stress levels dropped, patient safety improved to top 1%. By the time we got to the entire organization, oh, by the way, the departments that hadn't went the opposite direction. Their burnout actually increased, right? Their stress levels increased. So same challenge in the world, right, that they were dealing with, but being exposed to positive psychology completely created a bifurcation in terms of whether or not those teams thrived or they didn't. And by the time we got to the whole hospital system, not only are they profitable for the first time, but they have top 1% patient safety. And in June of this year, they were rated as the top 15 hospital systems in the nation. So I think to answer your question, what we're finding is we can provide this information, but if you do it at a team level or organization level, you actually start to see a massive scale change that not only impacted their outcomes, like their business outcomes, but their well-being and then their patients' well-being as well.
So Shawn, if there's a correlation between happiness and profitability, how do I, as a leader of an organization, spread a contagious happiness throughout my company?
I love this question because I think it's so important, and it's the core of real leaders, right? That this idea that we actually have to see meaning in our work and help lead other people to that, because it actually not only is important because of the meaning, but it impacts our success rate as well. We found that when the brain is positive, you're 31% more productive than your own brain at negative, neutral, or stress. In the middle of the banking crisis, I wanted to work with UBS. We looked at their stress management programs. We noticed that they were trying to fight stress all the time. And instead, what we got them to do is, in the middle of that challenge, as they were trying to help people through the economic crisis, we got them to acknowledge the stress, but then reconnect to the meaning involved in the work that they were doing. So same level of stress. When we measured them 6 weeks later, their stress levels didn't drop, still high levels of stress, but perceiving the meaning, the negative health outcomes dropped by 23%. So that's lower job effectiveness, burnout, headaches, backaches dropped by 23% for the same level of stress. So as organizations right now are dealing with massive levels of stress, massive levels of change, what we're finding is one of the greatest competitive advantage in the modern economy is a positive and engaged brain, which requires being able to perceive the meaning involved in the work that we're doing. We even found, this is Martin Seligman's work, who started positive psychology. He found that at MetLife, amongst one of the insurance sales companies, that amongst the insurance sales force, that the top 10% of optimists were outselling the other 90% by another 89%. So they hired people that were low on the industry standard test, right? But high levels of optimism. I've never gotten somebody to do this. Only Dr. Seligman could get somebody to do this. And they didn't tell people they were part of that study because it'd be a very awkward conversation. You're not that smart, but you're really happy you're hired. Right. By year one, they outsold the normal hires by 26%. By year two, is 57%. When we go to work with large organizations, we find if we can move their sales force from the neutral sales force, neutral on average, to the top quartile on levels of optimism, their sales rise cross-industry by 37%. When the brain is positive, it releases more resources to deal with challenges. Dopamine turns on all the learning centers in the brain. It allows us to actually have greater levels of productivity and energy levels and longevity. So what we're finding is happiness is this incredible advantage in people's lives that sometimes requires either creating positive habits, and we could talk about those if you're interested, or perceiving the meaning involved in the work you were already doing.
I want to focus on the meaning, Shawn, really quick. And I think I mentioned to you before the show, we're interviewing like social enterprises, organizations that are intentionally trying to solve a social or environmental problem. What we're finding is a lot of these employees are, attracted to these companies because they share that same values or that same purpose, which they can find meaning in, which increases their engagement, increases their positivity. What is the difference for you from working with maybe a social enterprise with a social mission versus what you mentioned with like a UPS banker or someone in insurance? And how do those compare in terms of happiness, I guess?
So interesting. I spoke at a large bank, not UBS, as a different example. And I came in to speak, and the guy who introduced me said, well, we're going to talk about happiness for an hour because we're going to talk about it outside of work because let's be honest, we're not saving the dolphins here. And you could see the whole room deflate, right? Because he basically said, what you're doing isn't meaningful, right? I think it's easier for some organizations to be able to see meaning involved with the work that they're doing. The easier you see meaning, we find it's a buffer against resilience, buffer against depression. It's a buffer against burnout. But I think one thing that's crucial, and we've seen this with some of the health organizations we've been working with that serve, low-income communities, for example, we find that one of the similarities between a social entrepreneurial type approach and one that's maybe a more standard approach is that you can have a very meaningful job, but it could still be exhausting, right? And oftentimes, the more meaning it has, the more you pour yourself into it, right? Which we've been finding, actually, a lot of the companies we've been working with in the midst of this challenge that we've been experiencing throughout a global pandemic, but also through the economic changes we've been experiencing, is oftentimes the ones that have a lot of meaning in their work because they feel that it's an infinite need on that side of it. So they keep pouring themselves into it without necessarily doing something for themselves, right? It's part of the reason we see obesity rates higher for nurses than the general populations because they're caring so much for the patients. Oftentimes, they're not thinking about themselves. So what we do is we go into these places that have very meaningful outcomes for the world, and I start with them. Here's some things you can do for yourself to raise your levels of gratitude, deepen your social bonds, exercise, those types of things that allow them to actually do that habit, do that work more importantly or better. But on that point, let me just say a real quick story you just made me think of, which is I got to work for the executive branch in the previous administration. I was so excited about it. It was a building right next to the White House, right? So I felt like I was going to Washington. I practiced my talk over and over again. It was a building next to it, an executive building. It was all these leaders of these different committees, right? And I came in and started speaking, and about 10 minutes into my talk, this woman raised her hand. She's like, I think you're really funny and engaging and entertaining, but I can't use any of this at work. And I just stopped the talk, right? And she's like, I can't use any of this at work because I work in the Human Atrocities Commission. And my job is to catalog all the terrible things that happen to women in the world. So I can't come in being really smiley and telling my team to be really happy when we're doing this. Then she told me that she had two of the members of her team that attempted suicide, and she can't keep people on her team because they keep burning out and going to do other work that's maybe less meaningful, but also less demanding, right? And she said when she sit next to a pool with her daughter at night, she'd feel guilty feeling happiness sitting next to her daughter. What I think I wanted to tell her is what I think a friend would have wanted to tell her, which is that you have to find a way of finding joy in the work that you're doing and in your life if you want to sustain doing those meaningful actions to the world, right? That optimism, gratitude, celebrating any of the wins you got allows us to actually solve more of those traumas as we move forward. So it's a shift in mindset that we oftentimes have to make with groups that are meaning focused, is that they actually have to create positive change for themselves first to be able to sustain that, because happiness isn't pleasure, it's the joy we feel moving towards our potential.
Is that your definition of happiness?
That's the one I use, because I think pleasure, when we pursue it, we just get on this treadmill. It's called a hedonic treadmill, where you keep going and going, and it has less results, like taking the same drug over and over again. So you need more of it, and then eventually it doesn't work. So we get jaded with life or with that job because we're not getting pleasure from it. But if happiness isn't pleasure, it's the joy you feel moving towards your potential. That joy you can feel even when life is not pleasurable. Working in a difficult job, working in the midst of poverty, working to support a world that's going through a pandemic or economic crisis. We are not going to be smiling and feel pleasure all the time, but we can feel joy as our work moves us towards a better place. And that joy becomes the fuel for allowing us to create a better world.
Now, this growth, this sustaining this happiness, I'll give you a story. If you listen to the show, you'll know I'll talk about surfing. I was coming back from my day on the waves. This is on Friday. And I see a father playing with his little girl. And she's got to be 2 years old. And she built her first sandcastle. And she thought it was the funniest thing. She was laughing so hard. And I just looked at my friend and just started laughing. Like, that little thing gave her joy. So the point I'm trying to make is this. I feel like as we grow older, like our bar for happiness always is going up and up and up. How do you sustain happiness through, like you said, through that growth?
So I think it's about reversing that formula that we've been using about what creates happiness and success, right? What I think gets us through school, we're taught it, and then we import it into our working lives, is that if I work harder right now, I'm going to be more successful, and then I'll feel happier, right? So once I put this Lego set together, then I'll feel happier. Once I get this good grade, think how happy. Once I graduate, think how happy I'll be. Once I have a job now, once we hit our targets, once we're creating change not for 1,000 people, but for 10,000 people, think how happy I'll be. Or once I get married, think how happy I'll be. Remember that one where you're like, oh yeah, once I find this person that I want to be with, then I'll feel happier. In each one of those moments in our lives, we keep thinking happiness will exist on the opposite side of success. The problem is every time your brain has a success, we change the goalpost of what success looks like, right? So if you build a sandcastle, that's not it for the rest of your life. I don't ask you now, like, are you successful? You're like, yeah, I made a sandcastle when I was 4. What else do I need to do, right? We want to see our success rate keep rising. That's adaptive. Where we get tripped up is that we keep thinking happiness will exist on the opposite side of success. My son puts Legos together. He's a 6-year-old. He has much more fun putting the Legos together. Once he builds it, he doesn't really play with it at all, right? But he keeps thinking, I'm gonna be so happy when I do it. And then he doesn't sometimes, if that happiness was only on the other side of it, he would miss all the happiness. I think the same thing is true within our working lives as well. I think if we shift our focus to, I will be happy when the pandemic's over. I will be happy when I reach this point. I'll be happy when I have this many followers, or sold this many things, or this many people listen to me, then I'll feel happier. That formula always backfires when we study it. And we push happiness over the cognitive horizon. What we really need to do is find that if we can create greater levels of happiness through gratitude for the present, optimism for the future, social connection, those deeper social bonds, meaning in the work. And when we perceive that, it actually raises our success rates on the backside of it. So what I'd say is I'm not seeking out like mountaintop happiness experiences all the time. That would be a terrible existence as a happiness researcher. What I'm looking for is how do I actually shorten the troughs in my life and find a way of sustaining those places where I feel gratitude, connection, and meaning in my life.
Do you ever have like one-on-ones with people who are depressed? And if you do, like what is your advice to them? Like they say, Shawn, I get what you're saying, but I really just can't put that into my daily life right now. I'm that's how I feel. Like what advice would you give to people maybe listening to this that are going through a really hard time?
Well, we know a lot of people probably listening to this are, depends on who you ask, but 20 to 30% of, some of the groups I'm talking to have been through depression or are going through depression. I went through 2 years of depression while I was at Harvard at the Divinity School before getting into positive psychology. Positive psychology was one of the ways that pulled me out of depression because I started having to create a routine out of these habits within my life. So what I would say is that what I learned at Harvard, studying it, but also experiencing it, is that depression is not the end of the story, although it feels like it in the middle of it. For me, it was the loss of joy as we move towards our potential. Differentiating happiness, depression, and unhappiness. Unhappiness is actually good when we study it. Unhappiness fuels us because it tells us the world is being racist or unjust. It tells us when we're lonely and we need to reach out to people, right? It tells us when we're in the wrong job. That type of unhappiness could be great. What we're fighting so hard against is apathy, which is the loss of joy as we move towards our potential, where we don't think joy is possible and we don't think growth is possible. And that's what I felt in the midst of depression. What pulled me out of it, the two most valuable things, one is I had to start creating a schedule of these positives. I got earlier this year, I got the opportunity to work with NASA, and I asked them as a return question, like, we're dealing with social distancing, right? And creating happiness and social connection is so important. So how do you deal with social distancing when you're miles from Earth? And they said, one of the very first things we had to learn with astronauts is we had to keep a strict routine. And on that routine, we had daily habits that were positive. Like while they brush their teeth, they think of things that they're grateful for. That simple routine gives them something for their brain to look forward to, but it changes how they scan the world. I had to do it, create a schedule, because I didn't feel like doing those positive habits because I didn't think growth was possible. So creating a schedule out of those habits was important. The second was I had to let people in. My first book was on Happiness Advantage, which was about how we change your individual habits that raises your levels of happiness and that raises your individual outcomes. What I'm passionate about right now, and it aligns so well with real leaders and with social entrepreneurs and businesses, is that I wrote this book called Big Potential, which was about all this research that we've been doing ever since, where we realized that those choices actually impact all of these people within the ecosystem around you. And that if you actually want to choose happiness, you actually have to create an interconnected approach to it. So for example, if you look at a hill you need to climb in front of you, if you look at that hill by yourself, these two researchers out in Virginia found if you look at a hill by yourself, your brain shows you a hill in your visual cortex that's 20% steeper than the hill you see when you view that hill standing next to someone who's going to climb it with you. So the geometry of the challenges in our life are in flux based upon whether or not you think you're alone or with other people. So in the middle of depression, I reached out to 8 of my closest friends and family, told them I was going through depression and I needed their help. What I did was deputize them to actually be part of that ecosystem. And suddenly they would tell me things that were going on in their life. Instead of trying to light up individually and randomly in the dark, we were lighting up together. And that's what pulled me out of depression. It's why I do the work that I do now. And it shows us that not only do we need to create positive habits, but we need to do it with one another.
So we all are human and we all like to trick our minds. Like you mentioned, we perceive the hill as being 20% more steeper than it actually is. What are some other habits like you referred to with the astronauts brushing their teeth, thinking of positive thoughts in the morning? What are some habits that people can apply to their daily lives today to almost trick their brain into being happy?
Yeah. So I would say it's even stronger than tricking it, because what we found is we assumed your happiness was just your genes and your environment, because that's what we assumed your potential was. And what we found is that people add in these 2-minute positive habits to their day, like brushing their teeth, it turns out that their levels of happiness rise above their genetic set point and the environmental constraints. So you could actually raise your levels of happiness above what you were born. Genes set the initial baseline, but we could actually move up. I actually got to speak to the former US Surgeon General, and he said, when you look at this room, everyone in this room has genes for teeth that should rot out by age 15 in a high sugar society. That's what it is to be human if you're your genes, right? But we found a way to get everyone to create a habit of brushing their teeth every day. And that 30 to 45 seconds transforms what it means to be human. So what I'd say, we know 5 of those things. There's a lot more, but the 5 that I've studied are, we get people to scan for 3 new things that they're grateful for at the same time every day. So your brain knows it's coming the next day. So your brain basically builds a background app scanning the world for 3 things you're grateful for the next day. So if you create a pattern for long enough, your brain basically starts to passively scan the world for the positives. It takes people who are genetic low-level pessimists and raises them to low levels of optimists in just a 6-week period of time. And if you keep it going, it sustains. So gratitude, 3 new things you're grateful for. If you journal about a positive experience each day, so you think about a single positive experience, and on a notepad next to your bed, or I do in a blank Word document, or a Word document I keep, and I write down every detail I can remember about that positive experience for just 2 minutes. Because if I do it for longer than 2 minutes, then I never do it, because I'm like, this is going to take forever. So 2 minutes, every detail you can remember about one experience. It only takes one node of meaning in your life for your brain to judge that day as meaningful, right? And so what happens is your brain connects the dots for you, and you start seeing this trajectory of meaning running throughout your life that was already there that your brain wasn't perceiving. So journaling, 15 minutes of fun, mindful cardio activity is the equivalent of taking an antidepressant for the first 6 months, but for the next 2 years has a 30% lower relapse rate. Not a repudiation of antidepressants at all. It's an indication of why exercise was valuable. It's a starter drug. When we study people that exercise, they start making entire constellations of positive habits, because what they're learning is that their behavior matters. And the final one that we got people to 2 minutes of meditation, just watching your breath go in and out, raises accuracy rates by 10%, raises happiness, lowers your levels of stress. And my last one is my favorite. If there's one thing I would want people to do, especially now, we were studying this before we had to do things virtually and social distancing. We got people initially at Facebook, and now we've done this worldwide. Their very first work routine when they came into work was to write a 2-minute positive email praising or thanking someone in their life. For some reason, we found text messages work better. We don't know why, but text message or email, 2 minutes, praising or thanking someone in your life, and you pick a new person each day for 21 days in a row. Day 8, everyone runs out. If you're feeling socially isolated, usually it's around 3. But then the important part starts to come in. You have to scan for that mentor who got you that job, or that friend you haven't talked to in 4 years, or that ex from high school who just had a baby, or that the soccer coach for your kid who you never really talked to, or that person on your team you never really talked to, right? And suddenly you realize there's actually an entire ecosystem around you. You write to them, you meaningfully activate them. They sometimes write back, but now they're lighting up on your mental map of social connection. That 2 minutes a day for 21 days in a row, we found raises you to the top quartile of social connection worldwide. And social connection is the greatest predictor of your long-term happiness, long-term levels of success. And we found out social connection is as predictive of how long you'll end up living as obesity, high blood pressure, or smoking.
So Shawn, all of these habits, these daily things that you can do, the problem I see is I only know a handful of people that are disciplined enough to sustain these habits. How long does it take to form a habit? And what are some things that you've done to sustain this habitual treatment of positive thinking?
So it's such a great question. So a couple ways. I absolutely agree with you. It actually requires discipline on the front side of it, which is why I actually push these habits. I only studied these habits in short form, right? We know if we can get you to meditate on a mountainside for 80 days, we can see changes to the neural pathways in your brain. You do that, you're going to lose your job, right? So what we got interested in is, could we do something that somebody could append to their day? So I think there's a couple things that make this easier. One is it has to be routine. So for the astronauts, they think of the gratitudes while they brush their teeth. So they know every time they're brushing their teeth, I've got to be doing this, right? So it's not like they have to expend mental resources to think, oh yeah, I've got to do that. Make sure it's on my calendar. They got to think about these things, right? Some people put calendar invites for being able to do that. I've never been able to do it because I haven't figured out how to do 2 minutes versus 30 to 45 minutes or 15-minute increments. But people actually schedule it in, which it seems to work really well for those individuals. So creating a system where you're always doing it in the same place at the same time dramatically decreases the activation energy necessary to start that task. If you do it for 21 days, that's why we're hoping people get to that level. We've learned this from Alcoholics Anonymous. If we can get people to that 21 days, we actually have a tendency of making it easier it's easier to go from day 21 to 22 than it is to go from day 7 to day 8, right? So at day 21, you're close to getting this as a normal pattern within your life. What I found is in August of this year, And part of the reason I'm standing up while doing this is I had to go through back surgery. So I just had it just 3 weeks ago. And, I was going through so much pain, and I'd wake up and want the day to be over. And I'm a positive psychology researcher. So I could feel depression coming back in and knocking. And I had to do those positive habits. And I did the gratitude ones, and I would write the 2-minute text message praising or thanking people, and they were my friends, so that I would have some sort of inbound positive support that was coming in the midst of it, because I could feel like things were so different. Like when people exercise and then they stop, they don't feel as good, and that's what drives them back into the exercise sometimes. That, I think, is what we need to have happen with positive habits. We want to get people to the point where they see how powerful this is, so that they wouldn't even think about not doing it. Like brushing your teeth. Like we've done that for decades, and we're not like, well, okay, I'm done with that. I'm so bored brushing my teeth, I'm out, right? You do that, you get cavities. What we're finding is it feels weird to not brush your teeth for 2 days. We want the same feeling around gratitude and optimism, social connection, so that it become a part of who we are. We won't even think about doing work without doing those positive things.
What I'm interested in terms of habitual like rituals and doing things to make yourself better is oftentimes we feel like we're in control, and we're in control of our own lives. We stick to our schedule. We reach out to people in a certain time. But, you mentioned insurance. There's a reason insurance is there, because things do come up in your life. Like, what is the role of an understanding that we might not be in control? Many people in religion do feel this way. Everything happens for a reason, right? We hear this all the time, or God is in control. What is your perspective or your take on religion and releasing your control of bad things that happen to you, I guess?
Wow, that's a huge question, actually. Let me answer it actually from the scientific side, and then I'll just briefly from the religious side. But from the scientific side, it's called locus of control. So locus just meaning center. So if somebody has an internal locus of control, they believe their behavior will change the external world, right? So I believe that if I work hard at tennis, I will get better at tennis, and then I'm going to win the game, right? Mm-hmm. Internal locus of control highly correlates with high levels of success. My guess is everyone listening to this has extremely high levels of internal locus of control. We also know high internal locus of control highly correlates with depression. And the reason for that is, if we think we can control everything, at some point we realize that's actually not the truth, right? And then if there are negative things that are going on in our life, it's now our fault that these things are going on. I'm not trying hard enough. I'm not doing good enough. I'm not working hard enough. I'm not a good enough dad. I'm not a good enough parent. My business isn't doing well enough. My book is not doing well enough. Whatever it is. What we find is high internal locus of control. If it gets too high, it actually correlates with these things to depress not only our mood, but our success outcomes. External locus of control, if you get too far the other direction, people don't change, right? They don't do any behavioral habits. It's actually pretty close to pessimism, because pessimists don't believe that their behavior is going to have an impact on their long-term outcome, right? What I think we are looking for is rational optimism, which doesn't start with rose-colored glasses. It starts with a realistic assessment of the present, but maintains the belief that eventually my behavior will have an impact if linked to other people. So it doesn't mean that impact is going to happen immediately. It doesn't specify that it's going to be exactly the outcome I want, but that my behavior will have an impact if linked to other people. I like that, because what it does is it allows us to realistically assess that there's some things in our control, some things out of our control, but if I act within that environment, it will have some impact on some outcomes. We know inaction goes the opposite way, right? When people's levels of happiness drop dramatically when they don't get to work, or they don't feel like they're making a meaningful impact upon the world. That's actually loneliness. Loneliness is not the lack of people; it's the lack of meaning in the relationships that we have with people. From the religious side, I think it's fascinating, because you get all different types of people's religious beliefs. You have some that God controls everything, so it's out of my control. So, God willing, this is going to happen, but I'm not going to act on this, right? You get other belief systems where, it's all about your actions within that environment, right? A social justice type of one, that you need to be acting all the time. And when we feel like we're acting alone, we realize that the world is so much bigger, right? So if you believe God does everything and then bad things happen, then you're in a challenging position if you believe in a loving God that allows these bad things to happen, right? So I think it becomes complicated about where people actually end up. I believe that, we have a co-creative role to play, right? That there are things that I can do, but there are also things that are outside of my control, and that shapes the way that I view religion or a religious text.
Interesting. So I think you're a great example of this as well, because for people listening to this, like if you search Shawn on YouTube, like you'll see he's got millions and millions of views. The reason I bring this up is social media now is ingrained in the youth of our society. You see many people trying to be influencers, trying to start their own podcasts, trying to do things for that external validation. For you yourself, starting off with that TED Talk, maybe I don't know when that essentially was released, but for you yourself, Shawn, how did that impact you and your perspective on social media's influence on today's younger generation's happiness?
It's a great and another complicated question. I would say that technology allowed the message that I wanted to share with the world get out way more than I ever would. I remember going to a talk early on when the TED Talk came out, which I think was 2010. And I spoke to like 200 people in the room. And when I got finished with the talk, I looked at the TED Talk and it was like, I don't remember, it was in the thousands of people who had watched it, right? During that same hour. And I got hooked on watching the numbers go up and go up and go up. And so I feel like I'm kind of both, in the sense that technology is the reason positive psychology got out so much, and that I was able to share this message. It allowed me to do the work that I'm doing, and I'm so grateful for it. Social media, I have a love-hate relationship with, and I'm actually in a short-term divorce with it right now. I've seen it create incredible changes in people's lives. I think it connects people who are lonely, who need to know that they're not the only ones going up that hill. I think that there's so much noise out there. If there's going to be so much noise, I want it to be more positive noise, right? I love it when people take over other people's hashtags that was negative originally and make it into something positive. I love that stuff. I felt like for me, and this is what we see in the research, the more people spend, especially younger populations, the longer that they spend on social media, as you know, their loneliness and depression rates rise. So we know a massive use of it, we already know scientifically creates a negative impact. For me, I felt like in order to get into some of the positive, I was having to wade through so much negative. I was getting diminishing returns on it. So in August of this year, when I was going through the back surgery and I was having to really rally my positive responses, I actually shut social media off my phone. I don't know if that's going to go on forever, because I think we need voices that are positive, right? We need incredible podcasts. We need people doing these messages. We need things like TED Talks. We need technology getting it out there. We can't all do that divorce. But for me, I needed a break from it because I found myself trolling myself in my own brain, thinking about what people would say, instead of focusing on the local changes that I knew I had more power over.
Interesting. I see. I try to delete my Instagram just during the week because I feel like I get like a little monkey brain, it just, I can't focus on a lot of different things. And like, I was curious, like if you knew like the answer to this, like what is the science behind what's going on in my brain in terms of the dopamine levels that are going on, and how does that impact my, on-court performance of having a podcast?
So the Social Dilemma, it's great. I don't know if you've seen it on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
I've only seen part of it at this point, but it's fascinating. They go through some of the designers of social media, and they talk about how they actually time when they intervene within your life. So you get that dopamine release, so you get hooked on it. And they make the joke, they make the connection that there's only two industries that we use the word users on, and it's drug use and technology, right? So people get hooked on video games because they know right when they're supposed to show you that you're making progress within your life. And it's easy to see progress if I see that I got a couple hearts or a couple people like me, and I can quantify that. What I found was that it was backfiring because no matter how many likes I got, I would then use that to compare with other people to determine whether or not that was valuable. And comparison is comparison's the thief of happiness. That's not my quote, that's somebody else. I love that because I found that, if I get, 20 million views on a TED Talk, I look and there's a cat video with 400 million views, right? And so or I'll put up a picture of my kid that I think is really cute and I'll get 2 likes, and I have lots more friends than that. And I'm like, I guess my kid's not that cute, right? So I was actually, it was interfering with the happiness I felt within my life. I think it's crucial to people's businesses. I don't want to dump on social media at all. I think we need some champions to transform technology. But for me and where I'm at in my life right now, one of the greatest things in terms of my happiness I've done is I got off social media this year.
Yeah, that's tough to do, and I commend you for that. I think I might have to follow you in your footsteps there. I was interested in another story that I had heard about you talk about, and that was, I think it was Venezuela or some the second or third world country you visited. Now we, like I mentioned before, interview a lot of companies working in the on the grounds, helping out these people. And happiness has come up about this, although it is raising the income levels of a lot of these workers. Happiness is something that we don't measure in the GDP. What's like your experience with working with people in third world countries? What have you learned, and maybe what can we apply here in the United States?
I think we have an idea that the external world is a good predictor of happiness. So if I'm working with Harvard students versus kids in Soweto, South Africa, working in a school with almost no books and dirt floors, we know who's happier. And when we measure it, that's not the case at all. That was one of my biggest experiences. We were talking about Young Presidents Organization before coming on. I got Salim Duji from South Africa took me out to Soweto, South Africa, when I went out there to speak to YPO, and took me to a school that served a shanty town. And these kids came running up, and they were so happy and positive. And one of the things I said was, who here likes doing schoolwork? I didn't know how to interact with kids. I was like, who likes doing schoolwork? Assuming they'd be like, oh no. And they like raised their hands, and they were so excited. And I went on to something else because I was screwing me up. And Salim told me afterwards, the reason they feel this is because they said that is because a lot of their parents didn't get the opportunity to even go to school. So of course they're excited about schoolwork. I flew back to Harvard, sat in this dining hall with vaulted wooden ceilings and Tiffany stained glass, listening to these students that are having this, six-figure education, playing misery poker, competing to see who was the most miserable based on how much schoolwork they had and how many papers they had and how much they had not slept. So it's about the mindset about that world. And so what I learned and had pounded into me from the beginning was this breakdown of this elitist idea that happiness was preserved for the rich, and that only the rich and the, I have to tell you, I spoke to one large organization. They had me come in and speak their leadership, and I was so excited. And they were like, we love this. This is who we are. This is great. And I was like, great. I want to talk to the store floors. And they were like, no, we can't do that. A lot of them are part-time workers. They're not really paid that much, frankly. They don't get much training. They come in and out. Some of them have family members in jail. We can't really talk about happiness. It was as if happiness was preserved for the wealthy leaders and not for everyone. And yet, when we research it, what we're finding is I kept learning about happiness when I would go into Venezuela or go into Soweto, South Africa, when I go into these impoverished places, and I'd find people, that farmers who lost their lands in Zimbabwe, who could still have high levels of happiness and optimism if they had deep social connection. And I work with extremely rich bankers and celebrities who have everything, but they can't go into Starbucks to get a coffee because they, everyone wants them to do an impersonation or to sign something. So they sit in their beautiful Hollywood homes alone, right? So it's about social connection and meaning and optimism and gratitude, which are actually free and is separate from the environment or the environment around us. That being said, I think what we should use happiness for as the fuel for making us a better world. That's not, all right, great, let's keep the status quo. I think we need more people being able to create optimism and social connection so that they can do more of those socially entrepreneurial ideas to make this a better world, right? Or that they can make this a better environment for all of us and break down structural racism or break down income inequality that severs us from one another.
And I know you've got big plans for this, and I want you to share that just a little bit later. I want to stick on this idea of wealth inequality and happiness. Affluenza is something I've heard about. Children coming out very affluent. They have everything and they're severely depressed. Many of them commit suicide. I think it's like adult white males above 65 but between 56 and 65 at the highest rate of suicide as well. My grandfather was certainly one of them. And it's a big problem. It's really interesting. Now, in terms of parenting and your overall vision of how happiness can be instilled into these communities, in every community, and we need to be a happier society. How does one practice that as a parent?
That's a great question. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I'm learning this real time. So I think I'll
Yeah.
have a different answer 10 years from now when my son's, at mid-teens. But for now, I just had a conversation with my wife yesterday. Her name is Michelle Geelan. She's also a happiness researcher. So we love talking about these ideas. And one of the things I told her was, I felt like that there was a point in my life where I can keep trying to upgrade my life, which I love upgrading. When I play video games, I like to build new armor and build new things to get stronger and stronger, right? Like when I build a business, I like it to grow and grow and impact more people. And I felt like in my own life that anything I would do to upgrade had such a diminishing return, because I felt like my life is good if it's all about me. There's a glass ceiling on my happiness if it's all about me. Now I can try and upgrade other people's lives, and suddenly that gets much more exciting again. I think affluenza occurs when we get stuck at that ceiling and don't feel like we feel any joy moving towards our potential, because we cap out because we're like, I can't get any better. There's only one way to go. And we, as our humans, our brains hate the lack of growth, right? The happiness is a joy you feel moving towards your potential. If you feel like there's only one direction to go, then we feel that affluenza that people are talking about. So I think as parents, one of the things we really want to do is that we can offer lots to our children, but that what makes things really exciting is progression, right? So like I bet we could afford whatever the nicest Lego is, but it's so much nicer to go from these small Legos, and then occasionally, when Christmas comes, maybe you get one of those medium-sized Legos, or a lot, right? So that there's like something that they're looking forward to that they have to earn by doing the schoolwork, right? So that they are participatory, earning this thing that shows that there's growth. And then what we want to teach them early on is that it's not just about you. Look how much happier it was when you did that Lego with your friend, or gave that Lego to someone who's never gotten a Lego before. And suddenly there's access to happiness you didn't think was possible. So one of the things we practice as a family, we're still doing virtual school with our 6-year-old son. And we start each day with a gratitude jar, and we write down one thing that we each write, my wife, my son, write down one thing that was our favorite part about the day before. So we have to scan for something we're grateful for. Then we compete to see who has the best one. My son always wins, right? And we put that into this glass jar and we keep it. But then what we're doing is we're not only scanning for it, but we're reading back through them. So we keep remembering these things that occurred a couple of weeks ago. Every time we've done it and read through the whole jar, 70%, 80%, I don't know the exact percentage, the majority of them I'd forgotten about. I was like, oh yeah, remember when that happened? That was amazing. But I can tell you every fire I need to put out of my inbox right now, like all of them, right? So our brain has access to the fires, unless as parents or as students, we're scanning for the things we're grateful for, our brain will just go to threat detection. So I think it's preventative gratitude that allows us to see meaning, that becomes the social bonds, the social narrative for our family, and then not tapping out at upgrading your life, but trying to find a way of helping other people.
Interesting. Now, how do you think like management has failed society in terms of business, overall happiness? And is there a way to measure happiness in the workforce?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think where management fails is oftentimes we think it's that's on you to figure out your happiness, right? And we talked about that hill study where the hills actually become steeper when we think we're climbing that alone, as opposed to with a manager, with an advisor, with a teammate, right? I remember I came into one organization to talk about creating levels of happiness, and it was a sales organization. And one of the comments that one of the guys said was, he's like, I don't understand why we're having a talk on happiness. That's or on engagement. We pay people to be engaged, right? Like this idea that like, I'm paying you to be engaged. It's up to you to do what you need to do to get there. That person's a manager. They're a leader. So this person is actually not doing his job if he's not actually interested in someone's well-being or happiness or gratitude or meaning, because those are crucial to their success, their job success. We know the greatest competitive advantage in the modern economy is a positive, engaged brain. So if you're a manager and you don't care if your employees are positive or engaged, then you're failing not only your team, you're failing to do what you're doing as a manager. So I think it's getting past some of these mental blocks about you be you, and you do you, to this idea that I'm going to model as a leader making these positive changes, right? With that Harvard Business Review article we wrote about that hospital system, The president of the hospital system, Jordan Voigt, actually came to the beginning of each of the departments going through that Orange Frog training, because what he wanted to do was, for 5 minutes, he wanted to impress upon them, hey, this is crucial to how we're going to improve your lives, the lives of the people that come in this hospital, and our bottom line. But also, here are the habits that I've started doing. I do these every day, and this is making a huge impact. So when you hear that from leadership, they're modeling it. It's not a flavor of the month type of idea, but it also shifts the conversation towards the positive, giving people a license to do that. So I think that we need to be measuring how much we're impacting positive change. I think as leaders, we need to be modeling it and starting doing those habits ourselves. One last example, we did a study with Training Magazine, and we found that we asked HR managers how much you think you could change other people, and part of their job was looking at training and learning and development, right? And it was depressingly low how much they thought they could actually change somebody. Then we got them for just 2 weeks to pick up one of 3 positive habits. So they just did one positive habit for 2 weeks. We measured them. Their levels of happiness rose. We already knew that was going to happen. Optimism rose. But then we asked them the question again, and their belief that people could change rose dramatically. So I think as leaders, we've got to be doing this so we recognize how much change is possible.
I want to stay on that, actually. That's really interesting to me because I got asked that question a couple months ago. Kevin, do you think people change? And I said without hesitation, yeah, of course, I think people can change. But the answer really wasn't that easy. I mean, the debate on the opposite side was a very strong debate about why people change. So, Shawn, do you think people change?
I do, absolutely. I mean, there's no question in my mind that we change because we watch people and we look at people who continually test pessimist, and then they apply a 45-second disruptor like gratitude habits, and we see that they break the tyranny of genes and environment over their trajectory of optimism. We know that people get into car accidents at 50 who have lived selfish, negative lives. That's who they were. They were cynical. They get in a car accident. They realize they could have died, and they suddenly become altruistic and optimistic. Right. That's a trauma that created a lifetime. So what I would ask people that don't believe change is possible, I would, if you could do it in a room, I don't know how you do this, but what I would want to do to someone who says that is be like, so who here in this room went through depression and got over it, right? That's massive change. Who here, experienced a period of extremely low levels of happiness within their life and doesn't feel that now, right? You can see that there are changes that have occurred from previous states. So I can stay in a trough for a longer period of time, or we can actually recognize that change is possible. What I find fascinating about this research is how these small changes actually create long-term impacts for people. Like gratitude exercises is fundamental to how astronauts set up their day because they know that it's crucial to the performance and their effectiveness level. So I've seen it within my life. I went through 2 years of depression and I'm not depressed now. So we know change is possible.
Shawn, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I can't believe it's already 52 minutes in this episode. I feel like we just got started now. We've talked about a lot, talked about management, gratitude, how to overcome certain situations, examples of good leaders exemplifying them doing these practices to their employees to catalyze that change among workplaces across the world. So, Shawn Achor, let's bring this home. The last question I have for you today is: what is your definition of a real leader?
I think a real leader is someone who is interested in more than just their own level of success and happiness, that they're able to model and to encourage and lead people towards not just better outcomes, because that helps the leader, but also that they're better by being in relationship with you. I remember I heard a consultant once say, this is Caroline Sammy, she said, which one of these, tell me the charismatic response. The subway system is shut down in New York and you've got your office there. What would a charismatic leader say? And most people are like, we'll rally together, we'll create some sort of change. I'll make sure everyone gets taxi cabs. I'm going to do all this stuff. And what she said was, I think one of the most charismatic leaders is one that's like, how are you going to get home today? Like, meaning that they cared about what the other person was dealing with, not just about their own response. And so I think real leaders are able to not only get their jobs done, but they care about where others are going on that journey so that we're not just working together, we're better because we work together.
Beautifully put, Shawn. This has been an overall positive episode today. I'm really excited that you came on here. And for everyone listening, thank you for tuning into the Real Leaders podcast today. For Shawn Achor, I'm Kevin Edwards, asking you to go out there, be interested in others' success. And always, folks, keep it real. Thanks, Shawn.
Thank you.
All right, good people. Thanks for hanging on to this episode on Crowdcast and on LinkedIn. Shawn's said he's going to stay after to answer a few of your questions. And Shawn, the first one's coming from Julie today. I hope I didn't ask this already. She asked, do you think integration with nature helps people bring more balance and gratitude, thus happiness into their thinking? Interesting. It's Julie.
I haven't studied it personally, but I feel it personally. I'll tell you two studies that support that idea. Both of them were done out in California. One of them found that if you get people to go outside of the office 3 times a day, their productivity rose. It didn't happen when they went and took a break inside of a building. They actually had to be outside. And we have no idea why that is, right? I'm not sure there's a direct correlation between fresh air or sunshine and people's success. So there might be something to do with being outdoors and realizing that there's a world beyond the microcosm that we're currently in that has an impact upon someone's levels of happiness. It's what I feel in nature. I think that's why people have religious experiences in nature as well, because it shows us that it's not just about us. There's something so much greater than us, which shows us that our potential can keep rising, which leads right to that joy we feel moving towards our potential. If our potential is capped really low in this office, it's small, right? But if our potential is big, it gets exciting. The other study, they looked at awe, and they got people to go into a forest versus look at a science building. And then they measured them on, they have an awe scale, but then they looked at their creativity and problem solving afterwards. And people who went out into the forest, their awe was so much higher than it was looking at a science building, but then their performance on tasks rose dramatically as well. So I think it's fascinating is that there must be some sort of connection between nature, being outdoors, and something bigger than us that yields higher levels of happiness.
Interesting. Now, Shawn, you mentioned a quote in the podcast. You said, I'm not going to wait until COVID's over to become happy. What is the biggest revelation that you have had in terms of this whole COVID stay indoors, stay away from people moments in time?
It just clarified how much it's easy to just get stuck in deficit mindset. I can tell you all the things I can't do because of COVID. I can tell you all the ways it's impacted my business or my ability to talk to people or research. Everyone else can go through and do that. It's what happens when we go through negative days, right? When I'm having a bad day, my brain just starts cataloging all these things. And sometimes I pull in things that are kind of tendentially negative, but look, it's still happening. This is negative, right? Like, it's like you're trying to justify a negative position. Your brain gets stuck. This is some of the work that we were seeing out with growth mindset. This is Carol Dweck's work, where she was talking about, instead of a deficit mindset, if you train your brain, or in that moment, get yourself to actually start looking for any growth that's occurring in that moment, your brain stops cataloging the deficits because it's looking for growth. Your brain can't do 2 things at once at that conscious of level. And so you start looking for, yes, I can't go out to restaurants, but I'm having these Zoom calls with, my extended family or with my friends that we couldn't do normally because I would need childcare to go out to dinner tonight, right? Whatever it is that somebody's doing, I'm looking for any type of growth. Yes, I can't go to the gym, but man, I'm doing more push-ups than I ever have, right? Or I'm walking more than I ever have, or I'm normally in a gym with all these walls around me, but now I'm out hiking, right? Whatever it is. I'm not saying that the negative's not occurring, but when you scan for the growth, it really transforms things for me. The other thing is, in the midst of this pandemic, my back basically broke, right? And they had to do the surgery. And what I realized was I kept thinking to myself, what I've heard a couple people in their 70s say, which is, I feel like I've been robbed of this day. I'm missing out on something I should have had experience. I should be outside today. I should be able to pick up my daughter who's 2. I should be able to go to a restaurant right now. I should be able to travel to wherever. Why? I assumed that I should be able to have all these amazing things in my life. But I'm not sure why I deserve to go outside more than someone who is a child in a children's cancer ward who can't get out today, right? I hate going into hospitals, right? And I spend a little bit of time there, and I think about children who are there all the time, right? And I started realizing, I haven't formulated the thought, but I just wanted to say it, that I started realizing that that every moment wasn't something I deserved, like I was entitled to happiness this day. I was just so grateful for anything I got because I was getting so little of it when my back was hurting that I remember seeing a butterfly come across when I was on a walk. And I was like, I would have missed this if I was still where I was a few days ago. So I'm just grateful for every single one of these days. So it shifted the gratitude from like, I should be able to do all these things to, wow, it's incredible that I'm at least getting to do what I'm doing right now. And it suddenly transformed the pandemic into something beautiful.
It's a beautiful mindset to have. Now, Shawn, you got a book behind you, The Big Potential. Where can people find out more information about this book and maybe give us a synopsis of what it's all about?
So Big Potential is my favorite book I've written. It's the least read, but it's my favorite. It came out the same week my daughter was born, 2 months early. So instead of going on a book tour, I was home because our daughter is in NICU for 50 days. And what we got to do is battle test the research that's in it. So it was all about how our happiness and success is related to other people. My happiness sat in an incubator in NICU being cared for by these angels who are keeping her alive when my success rate would have been nothing. Big Potential is to me what I would have wanted to write if I knew we were going through a pandemic, which is that if we think that we can pursue happiness and success alone, we're missing out on the true height of our potential and we're putting a cap on our happiness. But if we find a way of recognizing that there's an ecosystem around us and we find a way of surrounding ourselves with positive people, enhancing the people around us and expanding power out, defending the system and sustaining the gains together, then we can find a way of actually being able to create a system that lights up together instead of alone. So Big Potential is sort of what I'd wanted to share with the world.
And where can people purchase this book?
It's everywhere, mostly online. Online bookstores.
All right, folks. Well, appreciate you coming on the show, Shawn. Thank you so much. Again, this episode will be edited and produced and published to all of our podcast platforms. Just like you can find his book anywhere, you can find this podcast on any platform as well. But for Shawn Achor, I'm Kevin Harris asking you to go out there. Again, folks, keep it real. Appreciate you listening to this episode. And Shawn, take care. You've been a pleasure to learn from today. And folks, go out there and stay positive. Nice, Shawn.
Thank you.